Good evening and welcome to this double-billed lecture. My name's Charlie Jeffrey. I'm Senior Vice Principal of the University of Edinburgh, and it's a great pleasure to introduce a lecture which is both the culmination of the lecture series Our Changing World and our Enlightenment Lecture. I'll say a little bit about both of those things. The Our Changing World lecture series has been running for several years now and is a mix of a series of public lectures. So it's great to see an audience tonight from the city. And the lectures examine global challenges facing society and what we in universities might do in helping to address and understand those challenges. But at the same time, it's a course. It's a credit-bearing course which contributes to students' degrees offered to first-year students across the university. So we have students here from all parts of the university tonight. So it's quite a unique combination of a general public and first-year student audience. It's also an Enlightenment Lecture, which is the university's flagship public lecture, titled to recall this city's and this university's role in that creative burst of scholarly imagination in the later 18th century. And the strapline for it is that we ask global leaders to examine aspects of the Enlightenment's legacy in the context of our own fraught and hectic times, which is where I come to introduce Roy Greenslade, who's going to tell us about some fraught and hectic things in a few moments. But let me say a little bit about him. Roy is a professor of journalism at City University London and has had a long career in journalism, which has taken him through most of the prominent daily titles with which we are familiar. Back in 1969, starting with The Sun, then we have The Mirror, The Daily Express, The Daily Star, The Sunday Times, a period as editor of The Daily Mirror, as we were discussing earlier, both appointed and sacked by Robert Maxwell in a tumultuous 13 months. Moving on there to The Guardian and most recently The Telegraph and the Evening Standard. I have to say I know Roy's work in particular from his journalism in The Guardian, where he was famous for doing journalism about journalism. To quote him, I think the work of holding newspapers to account, that is, their owners, controllers, editors and journalists, remains vital because they still set the daily agenda and therefore remain hugely influential. Now, I think it has been the case from time to time that journalists didn't like a journalist doing journalism on journalists and complained about it. And I've got a longer quote here, which I really love, in an argument that Roy had with another prominent journalist. It goes as such: journalists cannot abide being the subject of the journalism they practice themselves. It's fine for them to hold every institution to account: Westminster, Whitehall, the judiciary, the police, the church, banks and businesses. And fine also to berate and ridicule everyone in public life, be they politicians or celebrities. But woe betide those evil commentators who treat their own trade to similar scrutiny, who regard media, and especially the press, as an institution that should itself be held to account in the wider public interest. Well, indeed, Roy. I think many of us will fully agree with that. We, of course, today have new questions about the accountability of news outlets in the digital era. And I guess we also have far-reaching questions about the sustainability of what we have called the trade of journalism. And that takes us to the title of Roy's Enlightenment and Our Changing World Lecture. Can journalism survive the death of the newspaper? I'm certainly looking forward to know the answer. Roy, please, you're very welcome.
Thank you. Very good. Good evening. I was honoured to be asked to deliver this lecture, especially knowing that I follow in a line of several distinguished people. They include the Channel 4 news presenter John Snow, who's one of my colleagues on the UK board of the international press freedom body Reporters Sans Frontières. When I chose this subject, it was pointed out that it's something of a companion piece to John's Enlightenment Lecture in 2010. In fact, it could well be viewed as an update and even a corrective, because a great deal has happened over the past 7 years. For example, Facebook and Twitter were in their infancy. Although both had taken huge strides forward at the time, they were nothing like as big as they are today. So I want to thank Professor Sir Tim O'Shea, Charlie Jeffrey and the University for inviting me, for giving me this chance to explore a subject close to my heart, the future of journalism. Let me begin with a little context. My trade, which is what newspaper owners and many employees like to call an industry, is at the centre of a revolutionary upheaval, a technological revolution, specifically a digital revolution. And we're all living through the disruption and are uncertain about when and where it's going to end. And more to the point, what, if anything, will it leave behind? Right now, it's hard to see how the industry can be sustained in anything like its current form. My task here tonight is to convince you that in terms of journalism and what journalism has achieved in our society over the past 350 years, its loss would be disastrous. Nor is there any point in sitting back and hoping it will come out right in the end. I fear that it won't, and I'm hoping to persuade you all to think deeply about the implications of living in a society without journalism. Now, the central problem we're facing can be told in a single sentence. The decline of newspapers is paralleled by a decline in the numbers of journalists, while the rise in social media is paralleled by a rise in the dissemination of fake news. But I have to concede there's a great deal of complexity wrapped inside that sentence, not least because at heart we're dealing with the overriding issue of trust. And to be more precise, it sadly means lack of trust in journalism. Now, I need to make clear at the outset that this is not, most definitely not, an assault on the digital revolution, which would of course be foolish anyway. I speak as someone who liked, once upon a time, to boast of being a digital revolutionary, and as one of the earliest adopters of internet tools, an enthusiastic supporter of the digital transformation of the media. And who, in all honesty, would not have been? Look at the advantages. Instant transmission of news, almost simultaneous analysis of that news, followed by rapid deconstruction of the analysis. What a wonderful combination. Speed, ease of use, open access, multi-level conversations, ongoing debate. In addition, we've witnessed the phenomenon of a running commentary not only on news itself, but on the quality, and yes, the lack of quality, of news providers. It's meant a continual criticism of the content offered by traditional media, scornfully known as mainstream media or legacy media, or, well, I'll draw a line over the expletives. Let's call it asterisking media. The point is that we who inhabited newspapers before the internet arrived were shocked to discover we were no longer the gatekeepers of news. Our top-down journalism, in which we told audiences what we decided they should read, was transformed into a form of horizontal journalism, in which we journalists and our editors no longer had the keys to the gate. And to be honest, the gate itself was torn down. Newspaper people had thought it was bad enough when radio and then television arrived to challenge our exalted position. But we gradually came to accept them and to accommodate them and to gradually, I suppose, form a symbiotic relationship with them in terms of news provision. By contrast, the net and what the net has spawned has proved to be a horse of a very different colour, because it threatens our existence in a way that radio and TV did not. Initially, as I say, I greeted the net's arrival, and I continue to laud the fact, again, who cannot, that it enables non-journalists, otherwise known as the 99.9% recurring of the population, to hold us professional journalists to account. You may well think that's a good thing, as I do, but it's been uncomfortable to discover that journalism and journalists are held in such bad odour by so many of the public. I guess it's ironic that the press gets a pretty bad press itself. Ironic but worrying. I believe the denigration of journalism and its possible disintegration carries great dangers for our democracy. Despite our shortcomings, and I don't deny them, it would be foolish to deny them, I remain convinced of the value of professional journalists and what they produce. Special pleading, you may say, but I hope to show you what you may lose by losing us. Before I do so, however, I need to argue the validity of the, not the first part, really, the second part of that argument, that newspapers are indeed in their death throes. Oddly, some people still don't believe it. Call them digital deniers, if you like. People who seem to imagine there'll be a magical reversal of the trend that's so clear to everyone else it's stark, staringly obvious. The end of newsprint is indisputable. Now, I want to avoid boring you with lists of figures, so I'll keep the numbers to a minimum. But it's necessary to give you some. So here's a pointer to that reality. As you can see, in the year 2000, the UK-wide national press, those daily newspapers published from London, sold an average of almost 13 million copies a day. By last month, that total was down to 5.8 million. And I've just seen the next month's figures, and it's worse still. Yes, we lost a print title in that period. The Independent went on loan only, but we gained a replacement with its feisty little sister, I. It's made no difference, however, to the overall state of the market. That 54% drop should also be viewed in the context of a recent acceleration in the decline of the largest selling titles. Even more remarkable has been the decline here in Scotland. The figures which I compiled a couple of weeks ago were so startling I thought I'd made an error. Not the case, I'm afraid, and here they are. In the first, I think that intake of breath was absolutely what I did too. In the first 6 months of the year, 2000, the Scottish Daily Press, that's the 5 titles based in Edinburgh, 2 in Glasgow, Dundee and Aberdeen, jointly sold an average of almost 1 million copies a day. But in the 6 months from December to June, the total had fallen to a little under, look at it, 277,000. That's the stark reality of digital disruption. Across the UK and Ireland, month by month, at national, regional and local level, sales of newsprint copies of newspapers have been vanishing. In little over a decade, 198 local newspapers have been closed. And the death sentence on the 199th was announced last weekend. And the same is true elsewhere in the developed world. We're not alone. Wherever you choose to look, United States, Australia, Canada, Germany, France, Scandinavia, the same story is true. Now, I need to add a qualification here. This does not mean, in case any of you want to protest, that all printed newspapers will die. There are two clear trends which suggest a minority of titles will survive beyond the lifespan of the majority. First, the newspapers and the magazines that serve the affluent and the educated elite will definitely have a longer lease of life. They include what we should regard as niche titles, such as The Economist, The Spectator, Private Eye, just possibly the Financial Times, although its UK print sale is already negligible. It's doing better in the States, where the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times are also enjoying something of a resurgence. Arguably in the UK, the Times has a chance to live on, but only maybe while Rupert Murdoch is alive. Since you ask, he's 86, he looks fit, and he's married to Jerry Hall. Secondly, as is demonstrated by the national success of Metro and the London success of the Evening Standard, free titles may outlive their paid-for rivals. Only, however, as long as they can attract advertising. And my sources at both titles suggest their managers have become altogether less bullish about ad revenue in the last couple of years. Anyway, the central, undeniable story is that newsprint in its mass form, by which I mean the bulk of the national, regional, and local newspapers of Britain, is living on borrowed time. The good news, and there is good news, is, or should I say, supposedly good news, is that newspaper websites have seen enormous increases in readers throughout the course of this current century. Even at the zenith of their print sales, most of them never achieved the size of audiences they enjoy online today. The figures are breathtaking, and I promise you these will be the last numbers I make your life annoying with. This selection were taken from the latest set of audited statistics. There are notable gaps. There's no Times, Financial Times, Telegraph, or Express figures because for one reason or another, mainly the use of paywalls, or at least in the first three cases I mentioned, they choose not to use the ABC audit. But I happen to know that all of them, bar the Express, have greater online reach than they achieved in print. The overall story is one of digital platform supplanting the print platform, and similar across the whole newspaper sector. This is acknowledged by newspaper publishers, who don't, in fact, now ever use the word newspapers. They only ever refer to them as news brands. Indeed, newspapers is something of a dirty word nowadays. Publishers are committed only to pursuing online readers, and in so doing, they're forging links with social media giants by pointing to the many thousands of Facebook likes that they get, the Twitter followers that they have, and depending, of course, on the links that they receive from Google. It's proof of the profound change in the way people consume news. Although it crosses demographics, there's clear evidence that the young, especially those under 25, have almost entirely rejected newsprint. At the end of September, at my first lecture of this term, I asked my 300 postgrad students how many of them, all of them, by the way, journalism students, I asked how many of them had bought and read a newspaper that day. Result? 3. 1%. So I'm going to do the same experiment here. Even though the age range here is a little different, I see some people who have grey hair as well. So may I politely ask, how many of you bought a newspaper, an ink on print newspaper, to read this morning? Better, a little better. Just a little better than my student cohort, but not much. How many of you paid for the pleasure of reading online? You paid for reading online. Just a little better. Late surge there. The answers to those questions are roughly similar to my students. When I asked how many had read their news on a newspaper website, more than you went up. Up went a forest of hands. 90% probably, but they are journalism students. So good news, sort of, but not really so good at all. Because like you, when I asked the 90% who did read online, how many of them are paid to obtain that news, the answer was depressingly small. Slightly better here. Rough estimate, I'd say 30 of my students put up their hands. And that is why I say supposedly good news. There, in a nutshell, is the dilemma we face. The awful reality. People are consuming news for free. But news is not free to produce. Publishers and editors are very eager to boast of their favored digital metrics. The page views, the page impressions, the number of unique visitors, the dwell time, the number of below-the-line comments, the Facebook referrals, and so much more. All those clicks are now easily analyzed so that we know who's reading us, what they read most avidly, how long they spend on the site, what they shop for, the ads they choose to view, and so on. The Guardian's analytics platform, OFAN, is so sophisticated, it provides us with a detailed rundown of every article, the location of the reader, the device they use to read it on, how long the user spent reading it, how the person arrived, what route, via Twitter, via Facebook, straight from Google, and then even where the person went immediately afterwards. This is just an example of, some of the metrics that we do on every single story. It's really not far short of telling us which individual tweeter brought which reader to us, and then again what they ate for breakfast. It's all fascinating stuff. And you can interpret the many thousands of readers who arrive each day, each hour, each minute of the day, because when I go onto OFAN, I can play games with it. I can actually tap in my latest tweet to my article and watch the OFAN score go up. Now, in public, as I say, publishers make much of these numbers. In private, however, the same publishers and editors know all too well that despite those welcome and increasing totals, the commercial reality is anything but healthy. As yet, and this is the key problem, they can't monetize, make sufficient money from those enlarged audiences online in order to fund what I'm going to call old school journalism. More of that in a moment. Publishers can't achieve the same revenue volumes that were formerly generated via newsprint. Now, newspaper companies have always enjoyed two forms of income. First, from sales, paying your newsagent or whatever, cover price. And second, their main source, advertising. One classic example is that the major form of income for regional and local papers was always in classified ads. Those small ads for motors and property and jobs. They were so lucrative They were famously dubbed the rivers of gold. Now, gone, vanished to the net, Gumtree and the rest, where ads can be placed for free. And one lucrative source, which compels local authorities to place their planning ads in newspapers, may also dry up if cash-strapped councils decide to pull them, many of whom are wishing to do so. So revenue is down, profits are down, and sadly, as a consequence, editorial staff numbers are down. And it's this particular aspect of print decline, the erosion of full-time staff journalists, that concerns me most. It's argued by newspaper owners and managers that it doesn't matter that they're laying off journalists because in a digital environment, newspapers don't require the same level of staffing that they had under print. By utilizing, this is their line, by utilizing their new online tools, they contend that individual reporters can achieve so much more than in the pre-digital past. I was talking to a local paper editor recently who told me that a reporter who may once have spent an entire day on one story is now expected to produce at least 5 stories in the course of a shift, possibly more. She contended that with digital tools, this was not only feasible, but desirable. Now, I like to think that she was being sincere. She sounded sincere. However, having monitored scores of newspaper websites, I'm afraid my conclusion is that a great deal of the content involves the very minimum of effort by journalists and is not redolent of what I'm going to have called, old school journalism. Journalism that really counts. Her bosses want us to believe that the size of their online audiences simply prove the worth of their content. We must be doing something right. Well, whatever that right might be, it isn't journalism. Their defences are a disingenuous justification for publishing too little journalism of real value to the community. The requirement for so many of their staff to devote their shifts to sitting at computer terminals rather than going on the road, wearing out shoe leather to obtain stories, degrades the activity of journalism. What is being achieved is quantity at the expense of quality. Journalists have become passive receivers of news rather than proactive seekers after news. They are denied the time and the resources to do much more than make a couple of phone calls a story, and sometimes not even that. Now, I am well aware that social media provides openings to news that didn't previously exist. Facebook is a valid route to stories. It's a source, if you like, a resource anyway. The net offers shortcuts to finding people. I also realize that information is more widely available than ever before, although I counsel journalists that it still needs checking. Wikipedia entries are not fallible. My own is a good example. I also accept that journalists in the days of hot metal did often get away with being lazy, and yes, we did spend an awful lot of time, let me take a drink, in the pub. And in Fleet Street at least, we enjoyed high wages and very large expense accounts. They're now referred to by those of us who meet as the glory days. And they won't return, and they shouldn't return. But sobriety, a more reasonable wage structure, and sensible expenses do not of themselves create good journalism. The change culture has been accompanied by demands to produce editorial copy so speedily and in such quantity that it's negated the potential benefits of more focused news gathering. In essence, too much of the output published by news brands is not journalism, but churnalism. C-H-U-R-N-A-L-I-S-M, a description popularized by my former Guardian colleague and longtime friend, Nick Davis, in his seminal book, Flat Earth News. It's about the reliance of media outlets and their journalistic staff on public relations in its diverse forms, with press releases forming the starting point and sometimes, too often, the ending point for news articles. Nick relied on research carried out in 2008 and dealt only with national titles. Arguably, at that time, the problem was more acute at the regional and local level. My monitoring of local newspaper, sorry news brand websites in recent years suggests that the overuse of soft PR-related content persists. There's even a scary jargon to cover this kind of pseudo-journalism, repurposing of PR releases. In effect, it just means rewriting what the PR gives you and is the be-all and end-all of too much journalism. Sometimes it's blatant. On a day I was in Bristol last month, and I happened to look at the Bristol Post website. Its lead story was that the food warehouse was opening in Bristol. But see that subdeck? It says, it will become a fast favourite for new shoppers. Will it? Who says so? I'm willing to accept that it might be interesting to readers, but that's advertising. That's advertising. That was the lead story on the site. So I mentioned this to a friend, and he said, "Oh, Roy, you're so naive. Go off on a little surfing journey across the other regional newspaper websites." And then I discovered that shop openings form a surprising subset of editorial matter nowadays. Grimsby Telegraph. Take a look around Grimsby's new Peacock store. That was accompanied by a promotional video, and please note also that reference to, in the second paragraph, you probably can't read it very easily, it says, the purse-friendly fashion store. I stress again, editorial as distinct from advertising content. And then, look, oh, we're so pleased to see that, aren't we? This is from the main news brand covering the county of Kent. Again, this was an editorial offering. Funnily enough, the only news story there is that 70 people turned up. And there was no picture of them turning up. I'll just leave that there for a second or two because I'm not making this up. I mean, I could have done 6 more. And then there's the frequency of mistakes in news articles. The communications chief of the newspaper regulator, the Independent Press Standards Organization, told my students 8 days ago that its officers found that many of the complaints reported by members of the public about news brands turn out to be inaccuracies directly related to fact-checking failures attributable to restricted resources. In other words, the number one requirement of journalism, give me the facts, is not being adhered to. Journalism is all about verification. And it suggests, therefore, that at the local level, the base level of our trade, the basics are being diminished. Now, I've got to be fair. These websites do, of course, feature some genuine public interest stories. There wouldn't be many users if there was no coverage whatsoever of local events. But the interesting thing was that during my surfing expedition, I couldn't help but notice an accent across the board on crime stories. I asked my friend, why would that be? Police PRs have become so good. Police PRs will not give you the information you want when you ring them, but when they ring you, they're giving you information which makes easy copy and it goes straight in. So, and sport was the other characteristic. So if you took away Aldi openings, sport and crime, not much left. precious little commentary and analysis of local politics. Indeed, almost no coverage of what local authorities are doing. And all the news sites, without exception, are clunky because they're infected with annoying pop-ups. It's further proof, because, of course, advertising counts. It's further proof of a trend I've been noting for some time. The public service journalism that provides people, voters, with essential information is gradually vanishing at local level. Judges have complained vociferously about the absence of reporters in court. Coroners say inquests are being held in front of empty press benches. Council meetings are going unreported. The UK's major news agency, the Press Association, recognised this many years ago and sought to pioneer the formation of a squad of so-called public service reporters. Nothing came of the idea because publishers wouldn't fund it. But things have reached such a pass that publishers have now belatedly accepted that the situation has got so bad they felt it necessary not to go into partnership with the Press Association, but into partnership with the BBC. The corporation has been persuaded to fund 150 reporters to cover councils, courts, and inquests in order to address the crisis. That's a thin layer. 150 across Britain is very thin, and inevitably, therefore, more will be required. But it is a recognition that commercial private publishers, in order to turn a profit, have made too many journalists redundant. We aren't doing the job. Now, they're expecting license fee payers to bear the burden while they go on making profits. Oh, yes, we'll take your BBC reporter. He can cover that court. He can file his copy. That's great. We don't need a journalist to do that on the staff. Now, it's clear that reporting on local government and local justice fits the BBC's public service remit. But is it really fair that the very profit-seeking newspaper companies which have axed editorial staffs should be the beneficiaries of BBC funding? The logical outcome of this initiative is for newspaper staffing to be cut back still further, and simultaneously for the remaining staff to concentrate on reactive journalism, in which their agenda is set by PRs. For several years now, there's been an imbalance of PRs and journalists, with the former outnumbering the latter by an increasing margin. It really crosses over just like that. Journalists down, PRs up. The professionalisation and growth of public relations is one of the wonders of the age. And it's blackly ironic that many PR posts are filled with former journalists. Look at this. Look at this. That is just an example of the number of editors who are just leaving the job and getting, and that's editors. That doesn't even include reporters lower down the scale or other junior executives. That's just editors. And don't look, and there's more. I could go on, I could do you lists forever. That's because they've been displaced from their jobs have changed, they're asked to do too much, because their pay has decreased in real terms. They are turning now to the more lucrative jobs in PR, what we used to call, I still call, the dark side. Many local and regional journalists are turning their backs on the trade because they believe their publishers are more interested in profit than in journalism. And the publishers reply, simply, no profit, no journalism. In their view, some journalism, of whatever quality, is better than none. But it's hardly an attractive prospect for our future. Okay, I get a feeling many of you might be nudging each other and saying, yeah, journalism as practiced by mainstream newspapers, especially those national popular titles, is anything but perfect. Is it really worth saving? Surely part of the reason for the decline in newspapers is about the public having lost respect for their output. So why save a journalism that appears to have lost the trust of the audience? It would hardly be for me to deny that some of the methods employed by reporters, some of the copy they produce, has brought the trade into disrepute. Phone hacking was only one example. I also can't deny, especially as I've devoted 25 years now to exposing and criticizing it, I can't deny that papers are too often guilty of purveying propaganda. They're greater spinners than any spin doctor. Indeed, they're one of the major reasons that we have so many spin doctors. But this is not a simple, single, linear, negative story. Running alongside the bad and the trifling has been the good. And yes, also the very, very good. Journalism has counted, even much maligned mainstream journalism. Day on day, the spotlight has been turned onto matters that people in positions of authority, whether it be in government, civil service, or big business, they wished to have kept hidden. Old school journalism, by which I mean laborious, time-expensive, resource-expensive business of verification, has not yet run its course. Amid the blatant propaganda and the celebrity trivia, newspapers have been holding power to account. Among the examples, consider these. The Daily Telegraph's exposure of the level of MPs' expenses. The Guardian's brave decision to publish the revelations by the NSA whistleblower Ed Snowden about the existence of mass surveillance by 5 governments, including, of course, the one in Britain. The Times' dogged pursuit of the story about paedophile gangs of Asian origin grooming girls in Rotherham and Rochdale. The Sunday Times' revelation about international corruption by FIFA, and the Sunday Times again for its really long journey to take on Lance Armstrong over cycling doping scandals. And of course, since I mentioned it, the Guardian's lengthy investigation into phone hacking. This, I could name others. This kind of old school journalism, evident at national level, lifts my heart to mention also that it's not alone. At local level too, there's been commendable campaigning and investigative journalism. Earlier this year, for instance, a reporter on a local weekly paper in London, the Hackney Gazette, won the prestigious Private Eye Paul Foot Award for her investigation into the borough's enormous but hidden homeless problem. Another local reporter from Essex was shortlisted for his coverage of the concealed cost of the eviction of travellers from an illegal campsite. There is good work still done in spite of the problems people face. But there's too little of this kind of journalism, and the reductions in staffing suggest that the situation will worsen. The direction of travel couldn't be clearer. Fewer staff, fewer resources, less content of genuine merit, weaker scrutiny of power. In facing the possibility of journalism's demise, we're therefore facing the possibility of a democratic deficit. Again, some of you may be thinking, where's the proof? Is this country going to be any the worse for losing journalism? My answer, based on a reasonable projection of the state of newspaper businesses, is that we won't know until it's too late. We can't afford to let journalism die and then see if it mattered afterwards. For all its faults, the good journalism, the good in journalism, far outweighs the bad. At national level, we're blessed with a diverse and plural media, raucous, partisan, too often ill-focused, competitive, helpful, because it does help sometimes the emergence of some kind of truth. The press has held power to account. Not well enough, perhaps, but so much better than in most countries around the world, countries that I monitor every day of the week. Without our journalism, we would be blind to what's done in our name and what's done to us and by whom. As for regional and local journalism, that too is essential because it's the basic building block of national news. Journalists working across the country at street level ensure, or should ensure, that we know what's happening. You might also wonder whether it's really necessary to have large media organizations. Wouldn't it be better to have lots of these little smaller outfits, the blogs and the hyper-local startups and so on, which have sprung up online? That would lead to an end to a media dominated by rich men and rich corporations. Well, to be frank, I don't much like the structure of newspaper ownership in Britain. But the decline in newsprint, the decline in old-school journalism has given me pause for thought. There's much to be said for several of the journalism startups, whether it be Guido Fawkes or BuzzFeed, Huffington Post, or the Bureau of Investigative Journalism. All in their own ways have good points. But it's undeniable that none of them can affect the national agenda unless they sell their stories or get their stories picked up by national newspapers and broadcasters. The truth is, if big government and big business is to be held to account, then we require big media to do the job. And one further point about big media, the need for a sizable staff operating together at a central point. There is something special about a team of people, a collective, working towards a single end. The organized chaos of a newsroom where each staff member is questioning the wisdom of another, where ideas are continually debated, that's the ideal forum to decide on how and what and why to gather news, and also to decide how it should be transmitted. I need to return, in conclusion, to the title of the talk, just in case I haven't made it abundantly clear where I stand. I don't think journalism can survive the death of newspapers in a form we have known and in a form which I value and which I sincerely believe is valuable to society. It is withering away because its business model is wrecked and a new one has yet to be created, but is much required. There is no incentive for publishers to do much more than manage decline as profitably as possible. And in managing decline, they are assisting, even if they are doing it in a way which they think is so clever. They are assisting in the decline of journalism. And that begs the key question: what can be done? My answer is necessarily tentative. Without wishing to sacrifice press freedom, we need a new way to fund journalism. It could be a BBC-style, at arm's length from government, public subsidy. It could be by forging or forcing an agreed subsidy from old media's Silicon Valley rivals, such as Facebook and Google. It could be, as happened when newspapers started, philanthropy. It could be a consciousness-raising campaign to convince the public of the wisdom of supporting journalism through paying for access to online news. That's problematic, of course, because there is so much already available for free. Like publishers, editors, and journalists, I don't have a definitive answer. All I do know is that we're in danger of sleepwalking into a crisis, and we as a society, as a country, stand to be the losers. I am sincerely sorry to finish on such a negative note, but I'm afraid that, ladies and gentlemen, is the reality. Thank you for listening. Thank you.
name's Phyllis Stephen, and I'm the editor of what you rather disparagingly called a hyperlocal news website, which is called the Edinburgh Reporter. We're also available in print as well as online. I was rather hoping you might have an answer, Professor Greenslade, because I was at a meeting down at News UK, which the Press Gazette organised just the other day, and everyone was talking about Facebook and Twitter and how they're taking away all of the online ad revenue, and that actually online ad revenue is much diminished. So I wonder what you might have to say about that. We're a hyperlocal news website with about 100,000 readers every month, and we do depend on advertising.
Okay, well, would you like to do them one by one or take them in batches?
Well, it generally works better one by one because of the problems of me retaining what people have said.
As you wish.
Look, I think we should put pressure on what's called the duopoly. The Press Gazette campaign is to get Facebook and Google, not Twitter, but Twitter's not so massively profitable, but Facebook and Google at least to subsidize. Of course, what you might have picked up from that campaign is that they're not really interested in your hyperlocal website. They're interested in trying to get this subsidy for big media. Now, I don't wish to sound disparaging in any way about hyperlocal startups. Valuable work has been done. And anyway, I've never been against any form of media starting up. I think everything that you do can have value and so on. But my concern is that by ignoring the work done by old media, as it's called, still based in print, lamentably going to pot, is that eventually we will need bigger media. Whatever work you do could be valuable, but is it shaking to the foundations, Nicola Sturgeon? Is it really going to have an effect? You need, in the end, big media to be able to do that. Now, you can feed in, you can be the basis of that, you can form an alliance with other groups and so on to do that. But right now, I think that we still, while we have the remnants of big media, we should be supporting that. And that's why I think the Press Gazette campaign to try and get Facebook and Google to offer some funds to us is a reasonable thing to do. Of course, it could filter down to you, and I think in a way it could be valuable too, because you are another building block, providing news which can itself be sold or at least given to other bigger sites. So that's a value in itself.
Thanks. My name's Erland Clouston. I was just wondering, in your heart of hearts, what would you say the chances are of The Guardian being around in 10 years' time?
Well, The Guardian is very close to my heart. I still write for it, and I've been writing for it since 1992. I've been enormously loyal and faithful to a paper, I think, that offers a genuinely different point of view to almost every other paper. I was at a speech by the editor-in-chief 3 or 4 days ago, in which he made it clear that they are going to attempt, by changing the shape of the paper, they're going to come out looking like the Times from next year. They'll be tabloid, as we call it, or compact, to avoid the tabloid association. That they're hoping to re-energize themselves and get a better print audience. Right now it's down to 143,000. That's very, very small. But of course their online following is huge, is vast. It's really up in 8 million a day. Good proportion, admittedly, in Australia and the United States, but still a huge number in Britain. Catherine Viner, the editor-in-chief, also revealed that for the first time, they've just gone over the point where they don't have a paywall, but they ask people, would you be kind enough to donate money? That has generated more money than is generated now by advertising. It's overtaken the advertising take, which is very heartening. In a sense, it's like Guardian crowdfunding. I also know that they've got an awful lot of money in the bank, a great deal, they're fantastic cash reserves. So, to just come straight to your answer, 10 years' time there will be a Guardian, not certain whether it will be in print, but there will be Guardian journalism. And right now, there is a very sizable staff on the Guardian too, so the quality won't drop. There's still investigative journalists there who are given time and space and resources to carry out long-form journalism that takes time. So, yeah, please all buy the Guardian.
So myself and many people in the row here, we are master's students at Edinburgh Napier doing journalism.
Ah, yes.
And it's interesting, I've read Nick Davies' book as well, Flat Earth News, and it was quite scary to see how many news publications use PR companies in the newswire, like Reuters and things like that as well. As an experienced journalist, what would be your advice for us starting out in this new career? Because I don't really want to get my first job just taking PR copy and then firing it out there. So what's the best way to start? I mean, many jobs we've looked at online, they are mostly for PR companies, for comms companies, media companies. Very few of them are local journalism jobs, and even maybe moving down to London's an option, that kind of thing as well, but not always possible. So what would be your advice for us to try and help this rather than be a part of the problem?
I always say to my students that right now it is the best of times and the worst of times. I love Charles Dickens. And I think it's the worst of times for the reasons I've outlined, that they are reducing staffs. You can't now expect to walk into a job. But I mentioned in my talk that I met an editor in Bristol. She was the editor of the Gloucester Citizen, I think. I was hugely impressed with her, actually. And we realized that one of the great dramas that's happening is that we are not now really training journalists in the way that we used to. You come out of university, and that's a good thing, but that they're not spending 2 or 3 years on a local paper, moving on perhaps to a regional and then going on perhaps to a national. And the reason that's happening, of course, is because too many people find the wages are too small on a local paper and they can't sustain you. By the time you get there, you're already 22 or 23 and you're not then being paid sufficient wages, get moving on and so on. So I know that's the worst of times. That's problematic. But it is the best of times, and the way the first questioner from the hyperlocal website has suggested it, which is that you must take advantage of the possibility of setting out your stall in online, whether it's a hyperlocal or a startup or a blog, and being able to progress from there, showing employers, national employers, what you can do. And you now have the tools to do that in a way you didn't have before. But I think, and I say this to my students all the time, it is really difficult to be positive about the situation. Nearly all of my best students end up going to the Daily Mail or the Daily Telegraph and sitting at a computer and rewriting copy day after day. There are so many of them at the Daily Mail that a friend of mine calls them a terracotta army. He looks down at the serried ranks sitting at the computers and wonders what life is like. And I know that's really awful. But many of them have progressed from there. Some of them give up. Some of them do give up and they go to PR or they go and help charities and they do all sorts of other allied work. And that is the problem. You know, I can't give an easy answer to your very difficult question. Be lucky.
Interested in your slide that showed the decline in readership of Scottish newspapers by something like 70% over a period of 7 years. That seems to be sharper than around the UK. Do you have any insight into why that's the case?
Yes, a part of the reason is because in the desperation of the London-based newspapers to find readers wherever they can, they've been aggressively pushing back into Scotland. So the Daily Mail, the Sun, which traditionally didn't have much of an entrance in Scotland, has gradually eaten the Daily Record's cake, taken it away. The Mail has made a big push in Scotland. They have I don't wish to annoy people here, but they even have a phrase for it in England, which is pushing out to the Celtic fringe. But anyway, so that's part of the reason. I think the other reason is that if I was to have compared what was going on in Scotland with what was going on in the big cities in Britain in terms of regional papers, there would have been somewhat of a similarity. So I think you've got to think that we're dealing here with Dundee and Aberdeen, Edinburgh and Glasgow, and you've got to then equate what's happening there with what's happening in Liverpool, Birmingham, Manchester, Bristol, and you'd find roughly the same pattern. So I think those two things are the reason.
My name's Katie Brooks, and although I'm a medical writer now, I used to work in reference book publishing, which is undergoing a fairly similar crisis, I think. But my question was really that I think for some people, the big newspaper, or whatever we're supposed to call them, companies now, news brands, the people by whom those are run have their own agenda, and they feel that the news provided by those outlets perhaps isn't as unbiased as they would like. So I was wondering whether it might be possible, you mentioned crowdfunding, whether it might be possible to have some sort of a model where people subscribe to something that's not for profit. So all the journalists and everybody who works on it are paid properly, but the whole thing is run as a not-for-profit organisation.
Well, this has certainly been tried in various places in the United States, I did mention philanthropy. I could have mentioned crowdfunding in the same breath, and some people are combining philanthropy and crowdfunding at the same time. But of course, you'd need to create that from the ground upwards. And I think, when I mentioned the lack of trust in journalism, it is because in our very partisan press, we've now grown to a point where if you look back to, say, the Daily Telegraph of 50 years ago, it was very much more moderate, centrist than it is today. It's almost hysterical. Think of the Brexit mutineers or something. And it's more like the Daily Mail. And the Daily Mail is nothing like the Daily Mail I worked on in 1967. It's more hysterical and more and less inclusive than it used to be. And I think that, and I don't even need to mention the Sun not being inclusive, but and that is problematic. I think that newspapers used to be party political. They're not now. They have their own values, which are usually embodied either in the owner or the editor, and they stick to those values. And the problem is that you then get what I call they call it now a filter bubble online, but it's the same thing. You get an audience who only want that prejudice reinterpreted, amplified. And then in the amplification of the message, you knock out all those people who are not interested in it, and you're just talking to the converted all the time. And that gets us nowhere. And that's not what a newspaper should be. It should be more open. And I think it would be great. Your idea is great. Get out there, form your own newspaper, start now. But it is problematic, I think, to find. Let me offer a word of praise here. I think Rupert Murdoch's Times is very, very good. I mean, I read it every day, and I think to myself, I look, and their news stories are not hysterical. Their comments it's not so much that they're balanced, but they're balanced in the sense that they got arguments from left and right and centre and whatever. I often on a public platform found it very difficult to praise Rupert Murdoch, but let me praise Rupert Murdoch, because I think he really has made something of the Times, especially with his editor, John Witherow, and the editor before that, James Harding. I think they did do a good job. So it can be done. I'm almost now in the position where, if I'm not careful, more people are about to subscribe to the Times because of what I said rather than the Guardian. But I think, and I could mention, by the way, in the same breath, although people don't read it, enough people read it, the Financial Times is also utterly a brilliant newspaper, and it has been a brilliant newspaper for such a long time. There is really good news from the Financial Times today, in which they too have got 800,000 subscribers, an all-time, more people reading the Financial Times today than ever in its history. So there are good papers out there. You don't need to necessarily worry that much, but I think trying to start from the ground up, that's our hyperlocal friend would like to do that, I'm sure, to get hundreds of thousands of people doing it, but it's a really difficult thing to do.
Thank you very much. Great lecture. Moira Forrester, retired librarian and book indexer, and newspapers in their heyday used to have great libraries and indexes. My point for you is, perhaps following on from your last question, what is quality journalism? Is it the quality of the writing, that makes you really remember what a journalist has said? And surely that is available in the digital as well as the print world.
It is available in digital, but I think my point would be that, there's good writing out there, which is, and there's good long-form writing, which you can get online. But I'm really talking about the central mission of newspapers is to ensure that power is held to account. And I'm saying that a collective with that focus, getting stories, digging behind the scenes, knowing who to go to, wearing out the shoe leather, that is the journalism that we'll miss. That's what I call old school journalism. Of course, there are great commentators. And I think one of the problems is people now confuse news with views. There's lots of good views out there. This is the old C.P. Scott edict about facts are sacred, comment is free, or whatever. But the truth is facts are sacred. And too many people go straight to the views. I saw the Welsh Assembly itself, concerned about the decline of journalism in Wales, has been holding an investigation. One of the people that went to speak to them was the Trinity Mirror. Trinity Mirror is one of the biggest owners of regional papers in Britain, also owns the Daily Mirror and the Daily Record and so on. And they went there, she went there, the digital online editor, and said to them, our big problem is that we find people are going onto the website and they are reading the headline and then going straight down to the comments below. So that our staff are now engaged all the time in themselves going to the threads to correct the comments from readers who are not reading the facts above it. So I think one of our problems is also, and of course one is bound as a journalist to blame the public, is that the public themselves are now so attuned to the idea that they know the facts, they don't need to worry about them anymore, let's just get on with the views. We have to stand that on its head, and the only way we can do that, I think, is by offering greater numbers of facts and going back to those basics, verifying facts in the public interest.
David Somerville. Thank you so much for your exposition, focusing mainly on daily papers. I just remind everybody that the monthlies, the New Internationalist, there's a magazine called Positive News, are all very, very important purveyors of thoughtful journalism. I'm glad that you didn't only show the downside and talked about a little bit about ideas of crowdfunding. I'm heartened that The Guardian is able to achieve this. And I really am making a shout out for initiatives here in Scotland. The Ferret, you can find it online, is a small group of journalists in Scotland, very experienced but growing and bringing their own in. Bella Caledonia, there's another associate.
Wings over.
Yes, and so on. So I do think that it is worth us all thinking about how we can support these small initiatives with our voluntary donations.
Yes, that's fair enough, and I'm not against that. I just worry whether that will be big enough. What I do think is true, by the way, is that I said at one point in my talk that I think the affluent and educated are going to be well served with monthlies and weeklies. The Economist has got a huge audience, and at the other laughable level, so does Private Eye. But that's not doing the job well enough.
I'm Louise. So you've focused understandably on sort of print journalism, but there is a growing trend towards sort of investigative broadcast journalism. I was wondering whether you felt that could plug some of the gap, not all of it, because obviously that's resource intensive as well, but there's growing things like Panorama and stuff, which actually do some really good work.
Yeah, I mean, look, we've always had good investigative journalism on TV. We've lost some. We lost one of the great programs, which was World in Action, which I thought was one of the best ever investigative programs. Panorama goes up and down. Sometimes it has a period where it doesn't seem to do very much, but I think it's done some great work recently. And there's always been a complement between broadcasting and newspapers. In fact, they've done very well when they've worked together. Channel 4 have done work with the Sunday Times. Very famously, The Guardian exposed Jonathan Aitken as a liar and a perjurer, and it did that in company with Granada's World in Action. So there's been a symbiosis, synchronicity, synergy, all of that between newspapers and broadcasting. The problem with broadcasting is that it can't campaign. It can't do what newspapers can do because the schedules don't allow that, because impartiality rules don't allow that. And that's one thing that newspapers can do. So you need both, to be absolutely honest.
Hello there, my name is Fabian Zibicki, and I'm representative of the Buchanan Institute of the University of Edinburgh, a student-led think tank. And my project is working on sustainable media and journalism. And I was wanting to inquire a bit on your view on government and media.
On what?
On government and media. What is the role of the government in funding newspapers? And you started talking about sort of BBC style of investments. And I was wanting to if you could expand on that, whether that was the only way for the government to involve itself whilst keeping a free media.
To be honest, it's not a popular view that I'm putting forward there. There are plenty of journalists who believe that even at arm's length, the government, you shouldn't get into bed with the government. But I think that we know the BBC upsets governments endlessly, so we know that arm's length can work. And I think, look, we're already doing it. I mentioned to you that the BBC had been persuaded to fund 150 journalists, and they're going to be persuaded along the way to fund many more than that. So we're already in a position where we see at the moment that the government, by the way, the government has been at the background of these talks, that we already see that they are worried that there is some kind of democratic deficit in not having courts and councils and inquests covered properly. And I think that therefore that is, at one remove, a form of government funding. Even though we pay it through the licence fee, the government organise it, the government choose who chairs the BBC and keeps a close eye. So it is problematic if newspapers do the same, but I think that there still could be a mechanism which could enable the government to subsidise. This happens in other countries. It's not a matter of great concern in France that it happens, and several Scandinavian countries it's the same. So the subsidy could be arranged in order that it still enables us to make sure that we're not enthralled to the government.
My name is Nick Trainer. I'm a lecturer in philosophy. I was also a long time ago, the editor-in-chief of my campus newspaper, and most of my friends from college stayed in journalism, so I'm still interested in it in a personal way. I'm wondering if you have thoughts on whether the geography of the UK makes this problem different or affects the problem, say, differently than certainly in North America, but also perhaps countries like Germany. So what I mean by that is, it strikes me that if you think about major American newspapers, they're very closely anchored in a city, and they have a kind of commanding audience because of the geographical distance. So nobody in Atlanta is going to read a Boston newspaper. Nobody in Chicago is going to read an LA newspaper. And there are national newspapers like the USA Today that are not anchored in a city, but it seems very different from the situation in the UK, and I'm wondering if you've given any thought to the geography of the UK with regard to this problem, or have any thoughts about it?
Well, funnily enough, the geography of the UK allows us to develop a national press that couldn't happen anywhere else. It meant that we could we could have an editor in London having a thought and a headline which could reach the whole of the UK overnight. And that was a blessing that wasn't elsewhere. But in fact, if one looks at the decline of American newspapers, and Chicago is a very good example where the newspapers, there used to be this amazing competition, and Chicago's just really fallen. And it's not the only city which has lost its newspapers and lost their effect. So I think if you look at the USA and the decline of its regional journalism, it absolutely is the same as the decline of ours. So I don't think the geography really plays that much of a difference. I think if you look at what's happened in the United States, the New York Times has blossomed in this period and pushed aside the great city newspapers. If you go to LA or Chicago or New Orleans or St. Louis, you'll find that masses of New York Times are being sold, or that people are, of course, going to New York Times website. Loads of people go to the website across the states and are dropping their local paper. And I think that therefore, and I, of course, I think the same thing is happening here, largely. People are going to the nationally recognized news websites. When something big breaks, they go to where, and that's the other interesting thing, they go to where they can trust. It's amazing how when a really big incident occurs, say a terrorist incident, you'll find that the BBC numbers go up, the Guardian numbers go up, the FT numbers go up. I can't do the Times because it's hidden from us, but I bet they do too. So it's clear that you go at that moment to trusted websites. The trouble is, of course, other people go elsewhere, and that's the success of Donald Trump. I didn't want to get through. Almost nearly got through without mentioning the name of Donald Trump.
And it's the last question. You nearly got there. The last question from that man.
Yes. I wanted just to give an example of a case that is apparently working. I am from Spain, and there, after the economic crisis, the big journals, newspapers were also in crisis and had a lot of debts. They had a big problems with advertisement. And the ideology was like turning a bit to the government and the advertisement that the government was providing, because it was the only money they were getting at some point. And in 2012, a newspaper, only online newspaper, started, and now this is they have 70 people working.
What's that called?
It's El Diario.es. Is quite successful. They have 20,000 monthly paying people. They pay 60 euros per year. That's the 30% of their income. The other 60, something like that, I was reading right now, is from advertisement. They are totally independent. They don't. This is one of the things. They are journalists, and the success came from because apparently, I think, because I was following the case very, very close at that time, 2012, that the ones that started the project were quite famous already in social media. So there were like thousands of followers in Twitter, and they had been in contact with internet and the news and internet for maybe a decade or more already. They were young people. They were knowing the internet. They had been gathering a lot of followers already, and they launched this media, and it's quite successful. They have like 70 people working for them already, and this is totally national.
And
so I think it can work. Is
this because people were rejecting El Mundo and El País and ABC?
Yeah, probably, but it's just online.
Only online.
And I will call it newspaper because I think they are journalists and they are doing a great job.
Okay. Well, I can't comment because I know very little about the situation, but sounds interesting.
But it's nice to finish on an optimistic note.
And thank you for that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. We do have to draw things to a close now, so let me make a few thanks. Firstly, I wanted to thank Jamie Davis and the team who've produced this series of lectures in the School of Biomedical Sciences and the Department of Social Responsibility and Sustainability. We really do appreciate the effort that goes into producing a fantastic series of lectures. Most of all, I wanted to thank Roy. What we had tonight was a fairly stark analysis of what's driving change and the consequences that we are seeing from that change. Newspapers in their death throes, the stark reality of digital disruption. We had, I think, quite a bit of anger at what has become of your profession, journalism, repurposing, PR, and those very self-inflicted injuries like phone hacking. But there's always that optimism there. There's always the sense there. There's still really good journalism happening. It's still holding people to account. It's still setting agendas better than practically anything else can set agendas, and we can't afford to let it go. You gave us a few ideas of how that kind of old school journalism could be sustained in the future. We've probably heard one or two more from the audience tonight, and that really encourages me, but it also says you've done a great job as our lecturer. So many, many thanks.